Welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with a very special guest, especially in the context of Philosophy Portal about to approach LACAN'S ÉCRITS, which starts September 3rd. I'm here with Dr. Samuel McCormick, who is a professor of communication studies and also has an entire blog series and podcast series focused on lectures on Lacan. So I thought this would be a fantastic opportunity to both link up with Sam and give some people some insight into maybe an alternative perspective or a new perspective on Lacan's work. And specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about Lacan's ÉCRITS. So welcome, Sam. Feel free to introduce yourself to the guests and what's going on in your world.
Hey, thanks, Cadell. This is super fun. Any chance that I have to link up with folks like you to talk about Lacan is always exciting for me. So yeah, as you heard, I'm a professor of communication studies here at San Francisco State University, and I run a newsletter, podcast, and lecture and discussion series called Lectures on Lacan. You can find us on Instagram, YouTube, but our primary platform is Substack. And there you'll see that we do a combination of things, but our main exciting project is always reading Lacan in lecture and discussion series. We just finished a series on Seminar 17, which will be released in podcast form, probably starting in September. And we are starting a new live lecture series on Seminar 18 in September. And we'll be doing that with the folks at APPI, Psychoanalysis in Ireland, and should be a pretty live and lit event. The structure of it is basically weekly recorded lectures, commentaries on Seminar 18, and then we get together every other week as a group. And I think that's what really makes it so special and so much fun, and why reading Lacan is unlike reading any other thinker, because in lectures on Lacan, when we get together as a group to talk, it's not just scholars, professors, nosebleed super nerds like myself. It's also clinicians. And that's one of the really fun parts about reading Lacan is you get an incredible amount of intellectual diversity. So you don't just get the professors like me, but you get clinicians who are at different stages of their career. We usually have a combination of established Lacanian clinicians in our discussions, and also trainees, independent learners from all over the world show up, folks who just want to talk about Lacan and have finally found a community in which to do so. And I think that's a really special and unique thing. Having hosted reading groups for a very long time, this has been a really miraculous outcome of COVID-19, is that we're able to gather people up, as we're doing right now, from all over the world, from numerous time zones, to get together and really focus on working through key texts in Lacanian psychoanalysis with scholars and clinicians alike. That's what we do in lectures on Lacan. So I'm really excited to know that you all are out there and now getting ready to focus on another key text in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the ÉCRITS. So I'm psyched to talk with you about it and eager to see how you all flow through this very difficult text. But I think there are some strategies that we could talk about that might make it a little easier too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, it's interesting too, because I was finishing my doctorate actually about 8 months, I think, before COVID-19 hit. And then when COVID-19 hit, that was sort of a time in which a lot of people were transitioning to new intellectual formats mediated through virtuality, where actually a lot of things opened up. A lot of people were doing communications work, teaching work, circling work, just group seminar work, where technology was there, but perhaps the social background was not there for, and so actually things did open up there. And actually, I think the origin of Philosophy Portal comes in some sense motivated by that event as well. So it's interesting.
It's terrific. Yeah, and I don't think we're alone out there either. Although it's
right.
been Lacan has a kind of interesting trajectory and traction in independent learning communities. And I think it's in part because it's backed up by this very real and unique experience known as analysis. I think Alain Badiou is precisely right when he says that part of what makes psychoanalysis an anti-philosophy, part of what makes Lacanian psychoanalysis so unique is that you have this thing called the psychoanalytic act. You have this experience known as analytic experience. You have this place where the concepts and critical inquiries of psychoanalysis hit the ground, and that is in analysis. And I think that's a really unique part of this, and part of the reason why Lacan gets so much traction in these newfound virtual spaces, because there is this element that you don't get if you're reading like a Hegel or a Kierkegaard or a Heidegger or an Arendt or a Kristeva. You're not going to find this very applied space. And as a result, an entire profession of folks who are intrigued by the topic. And that's just it, right? It's like you can sit down and read the British Object Relations School. You can just sit down with Winnicott and so forth and just read that shit. Lacan, though, is a different animal. And I think one of the questions that is probably going to be on everyone's mind in your sessions on ÉCRITS is, why is he doing this? Why is he writing like this? Why does the prose look this way? Why is there a single sentence paragraph followed by a multi-sentence paragraph, just at the level of form alone? And I think that's a really daunting part about working through his ÉCRITS, is that it's kind of baffling, the style and the approach to discussing topics that you would think he would have a stake in making very accessible to clinicians and practitioners. But that's not how Lacan rolls. And if you've seen our series lectures on Lacan, you know that part of our challenge is to render these texts clear, coherent, and accessible. And the same is true of ÉCRITS. You can see it in our series on often overlooked essays in ÉCRITS. Even the often overlooked pieces deserve attention and require lots of it to kind of be distilled and brought forth in all of what I believe to be quite brilliant.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting that you bring up the έκrit in terms of its style first and foremost. Was maybe start with style as opposed to the specific content. And what always struck me about the έκrit and what stayed with me since I started reading the έκrit was actually how he opens up the έκrit, the overture to this collection, where he's talking specifically about the style as the man, as long as we include the other that one is addressing, right? So this line, and then the question, which seems to me to be so profound, is, what is the meaning of addressing the other if it's nothing but the echoing locus of our own discourse? And this line of thinking seems to me to be getting at really the core of the start of the motivation of it, which is, the one and one, the other one's addressing. Why do you think the style he's choosing is so obscure, often seen as elitist, in comparison to the seminars? Maybe let's just start there. What's going on here in your view?
Well, I've published a couple of books, and one of the reasons why I really like doing this format instead is because writing for me is an agonizing process. It's not an antagonistic process, but it's a struggle. I'm proud of my writing. I've always been proud of my published works, and I like how they turn out. My last book, The Chattering Mind, I really enjoyed writing it, but also found that in typical form, it was really a struggle sometimes to get these ideas out on the page. So for instance, in the opening chapter, part 1 of The Chattering Mind is on Søren Kierkegaard. And I've been working with Kierkegaard for a long time, and in fact, finished that section of the book while at Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies in Denmark. So I was really steeped in the material at the time. And it came to this point where I was weaving Kierkegaard and Badiou together to really think through Kierkegaard's theory of the public in the 1840s. And the materials were all there. I had all the support I needed, and really sitting down and just trying to work to make the text clear and make it coherent for folks who didn't know Badiou but read Kierkegaard, or who had lots of social theory but didn't know anything about Kierkegaard. So I found the process agonizing. It reminded me of all my times coming up, struggling to write. And my reading of Lacan's ÉCRITS is that he is somebody who struggled with writing. He reads like somebody who has a very tortured approach to his own prose. And I think you see him very differently at the podium. And I think this is one of the questions that we get into in our recent series on seminars 16, 17, and I expect it'll be present when we start 18 in September, is who is Lacan behind the podium? You mentioned discourse a few minutes ago. Which discourse does he occupy? He's certainly not playing analyst when he steps up to the mic. He is resistant and reluctant to play professor or the university discourse when he steps up to the mic. I think he's inclined to play the hysteric when he shows up to address his audiences, and that's verbal. You talk about Lacan on the page, that's another question. At the start of seminar 11, Lacan says, I'm a poem. Basically, that speaking the way he speaks is kind of like a poetic live poetry, if you will. I think that what's happening on the page in ÉCRITS is a writer who struggles and oftentimes errs on the side of profundity and elusiveness, not in a way that suggests to me somebody who doesn't know how to write, because that's quite the opposite here. He's a fantastic writer, but somebody who approaches writing the way I believe a modern poet would approach writing. I think that the best way to read Lacan is as poetry. The best way to hear Lacan is precisely as he said, I am a poem. Hear him as a poem, but read ÉCRITS like poetry, I think. And what that means is, first and foremost, that you have to rely on a really great translation, which I think Bruce has given us here. It's terrific translation. But also you have to read ÉCRITS in search of musicality, in search of sound. I think it's important to read the ÉCRITS alongside the French, and one line at a time. You read it almost as you've heard Bruce Fink put it in other contexts, to the letter. You really want to take Lacan literally, I think, when you're reading him on the page. And I don't mean in the seminars that have been transcribed and published. I mean, when you're reading his actual prose, I think it's important to read it to the letter, read it as poetry, keep an eye on the musicality of the thing, read it alongside the French. If you can read the French, even better, because that's his original language and it's going to be a lot more, it's going to be popping more. But I think you can trust the English translation. Whenever I've gone back from English into the French, I've always been wowed by the work that Bruce does to bring forth a lot of what Lacan is up to. So I think you can trust the English, but I still think you should read it. Read ÉCRITS like it's a book of poetry, and modern poetry, contemporary poetry, you might even say. Some of the stuff that the young folks are producing in the past like 10 or 15 years, where you have like different themes popping, many allusions going on at once. And I think that's part of what you have to bear in mind when you read Lacan stylistically, is that he's throwing a lot on the page that is an invitation for readers to then say, oh, okay, what's that myth of Bodhisattva that we should check out? And then you go to the internet or you go to wherever you have your resources and you look up the reference. And a lot of times that's just tremendously revealing. So for instance, in seminar 17 or 16, Lacan mentions the myth of the Danaides, where you have these 50 women who are married off and they oppose it, and 49 of them cut off the heads of their husbands, and then they're condemned. Yeah, right, welcome to that jungle. Then they're condemned to fill a pitcher that has a leak in it that pours out. And so their punishment is that for eternity, you can think of this as kind of a proto-Sisyphean thing, where their punishment for eternity is to go fetch a bucket of water and pour it into this big vessel that is leaky. And because the vessel is leaky, their job is endless and it never completes. That's why it's a punishment. This is just a passing line in Lacan's work. But at the same time, it's tremendously illustrative of what he's doing with knowledge, with discourse, with the knowledge process in Seminar 17 as an ever leaky process that works by the very fact that it has a dysfunction built into it. And you can get all of that out of a myth, and he just throws it out like it's just a little reference point. My point here, though, is that just like you would read a very dense poetic text and work with the music and the resonances, and then take an illusion and track it down and learn more about it, that is also the approach that one should have, I believe, in reading the ÉCRITS, because Lacan has tons of little allusions there that if you go and look them up and do the hard work, you can open up that text in wildly unique ways. And that's something else I would just add here, because I know we're trying to get students ready to read this text. People think that, that you have to be smart to read Lacan. You don't. You have to be stubborn to read Lacan. And what I mean by that is you have to have follow through to read Lacan. The difference between people who I think understand Lacan and those who don't, it's not about brain power. It's about stick-with-itness. Lacan requires that you sit down and work. And that's part of the dilemma that I think you see among younger would-be Lacanians, is that a lot of them burn hot. And the desire for Lacan is big, but few of them have sides on their skillets. And as a result, everything you crack or put on their hot surface just slides right off and into the fire. To read Lacan, you can't just be a hot surface on which a Lacan text can meet your brilliant mind and work through this shit. Your surface has to have sides like a skillet so that the Lacanian text you're considering can sit in that pan and fry for a while, cook for a little while. And that's not desire, that's will. In order to read Lacan, you have to be a willful motherfucker. You have to be obstinate. You have to have precisely what the slave at the end of Hegel's famous chapter possesses, this Eigensinn, this sense of one's own, this kind of obstinacy that you see in the Grimm brothers' tale also of the obstinate child. You have to be able to be stubborn with these texts, refusing to let them go. And that doesn't take brain power. In fact, you should be probably an idiot. An idiot is the best person to read Lacan. The dumber you are, the better you are. The more you can just donkey through Lacan, the better off you're going to be. And that's what I've noticed in my own reading of Lacan, is that the longer I've stuck with it, the easier it gets to read him, which is not saying a lot. That makes sense. It's true of any difficult figure that you might read. But with Lacan, there is that initial hurdle. So we mentioned Kierkegaard. If you've looked into Kierkegaard's work, it's fun, it's funny, it's interesting, it's wild. Freud, very accessible. Anybody can crack a Freud book and really just get right in there. He's a very clear writer. The cost of admission to Lacan's work is quite high, even in the seminars, but especially in the writings. And I think that's a real challenge for people, is that you crack this text and right out of the gates, you're like, what the fuck is happening? There are strategies for working the text, which we can talk about, but right out of the gates, first and foremost, is just being able to stick with it the way you would stick with a book of poetry, no matter how confounding its opening stanzas might be.
Yeah, fantastic. I've never really heard it put that way, that Lacan should be read almost as music, as poetry, but that makes a lot of sense. Also, I've heard people talk about reading Lacan as literature, as opposed to necessarily science, because he's obviously extraordinarily influenced by literature. And I also like this emphasis on will over desire. You might, what was coming to my mind was also drive, maybe even death drive. In regards to, you know, the emphasis on stubbornness and sticking with it and moving through it. I mean, I think also at Philosophy Portal, a lot of people have had that perspective on Hegel, that the cost of admission is very high. And so in some sense, it's interesting having Lacan and Hegel put together, and certainly Lacan referencing Hegel oftentimes, is because for both of those writers, the cost of admission is incredibly high. Whereas I agree with you.
Point.
I agree with you. I agree with you also about Freud, where you can sit down and read. Even my opinion is actually that Freud's highest cost of admission comes with Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But if you read some of his other texts, it's much easier to get into.
Yeah.
When you were talking specifically about the stubbornness and even being an idiot to be able to read Lacan, it reminded me of your lectures, specifically where I started your lectures on the Écrits, with your commentaries on subverting the subject of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a distinction throughout your lectures on the Écrits which stuck out to me, which was emphasizing knowledge is on the side of consciousness and truth is on the side of the unconscious, and that we should understand knowledge and truth as constantly mashing each other up in a bizarre way. And the reason why it reminded me of that is because you were emphasizing you need to be a little bit of an idiot. So like when we usually think about knowledge, we think about like a smart professor, perhaps had knowledge equal to self-consciousness. And of course, the model of self-consciousness may be derived from the history of philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, even up to Hegel, versus this sort of disruption of psychoanalysis, this eruption of truth, and it not being equal to consciousness, it not being equal to our knowledge, and this creating a big fissure in the field of knowledge. So I'd be interested to know how you, maybe in both reading the Écrits and maybe if you like even your own life, think about the relationship between knowledge and truth, consciousness and unconsciousness.
Mm-hmm. That distinction doesn't always hold, but it does in some of the writings. And I think that's important to note here is that when's Écrits published? Is that 66?
That sounds right to me. Definitely mid 60s.
Yeah. So when you start getting into late 60s, Lacan is when he starts changing up a lot of what he's said so far about knowledge and truth. I think Seminar 17 is a really terrific spot where you can see and really study the meeting point between knowledge and truth. I'm reminded of some of the shit that Immanuel Kant went through in the 1790s. There was a pretty gnarly king that came into focus, and conservative king, and was really concerned about what was about to become the fourth critique, which would have been a critique of religion. And so you can read late Kant and you can read these pieces that would have amounted in a fourth critique. And one of the things that came up in that period is this king and his advisors are going to Kant, and they're like, bro, fucking cut it off. Why do you keep messing with religion? Why do you keep trying to like criticize the church and all this kind of stuff? And there was Rosicrucianism and kind of weird business happening at the time. And Kant's point, I think, was a very good one. He said, I'm not trying to critique religion. I'm trying to find the outer limits of knowledge and reason so that I can know when I need to begin to worship instead. He wanted to know what he wanted to know was when thinking should stop and belief or faith should kick in. And that's a different thing than what the authorities thought he was up to. He wasn't undermining religion. He was trying to find the point at which faith would begin and reason would stop working. And I think he came pretty close to finding that point. I think the same is true of late 60s Lacan around knowledge and truth. You could see this when he's working out theories of discourse and his broad just theory of discourse generally. He says that in the bottom part of any four-footed discourse, and you know the discourse I'm talking about, where we have the agent in the upper left-hand quadrant, the other or the addressee in the upper right. In the bottom right, you have what's produced from that discourse or that address. And then in the left, you have truth, the lower left. In between truth and production in the theory of discourse that Lacan gives us in the 1960s is this realm of impossibility. And it's here in this field of impossibility, which verges on truth, which is in the lower left-hand quadrant of every discourse for Lacan, that you start seeing this point at which knowledge opens up into ways of speaking that are truthful. And by that, Lacan means half said and half unsaid. There's the part of truth which can be spoken, but at the outer limit of that statement of truth, beyond knowledge, there's this place where discourse, he says, is abolished, where you can say no more. And this is when you start getting into the field of truth, into what you were calling earlier the field of the unconscious. But I think it's very interesting that in later Lacan, so after ÉCRITS is published, you really see him sitting down and trying to work the relationship between knowledge and truth, and really finding the outer limit of knowledge as a process, as an open-ended process that opens into or outward into a field of truth, where things can be half said, and where those half sayings always are up against the real. And so I think in later Lacan, you get a theory of knowledge and truth that is more profound than what you see in 1966 popping in the ÉCRITS. Nevertheless, I think there's very important work to be done around the distinction between self-consciousness, as fantasized by Descartes, is the big whipping boy for Lacan on this point, and the unconscious, which is theorized and celebrated by Lacan in the works of Freud. So you have this idea that Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am. Lacan thinks that this made possible the unconscious discovery of Freud, but then also the unconscious had to be there already in Descartes' work, just unspoken and unaddressed. And so you get for Lacan a really terrific, if you will, dialectic between Freudian theories of the unconscious and Cartesian theories of a thinking subject. And it really just amounts to a pretty slick little bumper sticker that you get from Lacan in the mid-50s, all of which is contained in ÉCRITS, in the Agency of the Letter essay, I believe. But that critique recurs throughout Lacan's work, that critique of Descartes. And it's that wherever you think you're thinking, rest assured you're not. And it's precisely, Lacan says, where you don't think you're thinking, that you're having all of your most profound thoughts. And that little saying captures a lot of what I think you're getting at here around knowledge and truth. When knowledge is mapped onto self-consciousness, epistemology, epistemes, and the like, if you like Foucault instead, and truth gets linked up with the unconscious. I cue up Lacan's theory of discourse because that's precisely what the position of truth is for any discursive subject. Truth is that aspect of one's subject position that is kind of like a lost cause, a true origin of one's agency. And that's what you see. The lower left-hand quadrant of any given discourse for Lacan is a lost cause relative to the agency effected and then practiced by the agent in the upper left-hand quadrant. Now that puts you a little bit in the weeds with Seminar 17 and asks a lot of folks, to be able to process that, I think. But it's a very good invitation, I would suggest, once folks have read the ÉCRITS, to move forward into late 1960s Lacan, where a lot of this stuff comes into focus. I think really from Seminar 16 to Seminar 17, you get the knowledge, truth, discourse cluster really worked out. And it's a really natural flow, I think, from ÉCRITS into these so-called later Lacan seminars. So I offer this not so much as a confusion, but as an invitation for folks to really start moving into Seminars 16, because we got a new translation on the way of Seminar 16, and into Seminar 17, which we already have a terrific translation of. So these texts are ripe and ready once folks have dabbled in ÉCRITS. And it's worth noting too that ÉCRITS ends with science and truth. And so you get a lot of these topics popping at the very end. And I think it's just a perfect segue from there into Seminars 16 and 17, where again, knowledge and truth get worked out. And that's kind of what I'm alluding to here.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think in preparing specifically to teach on the écrits, I was trying to be sort of aware of the major phases and movements of Lacan's career, in which Lacan is in the écrits situated kind of in the middle, which I take to be in the middle of the imaginary at the beginning and the real at the end. Where
Oh, that's interesting.
in the écrit, he's most, to me, what's clear in the écrit is that his focus is on the symbolic function. His focus is on the symbolic register, whereas maybe in the 1930s he's starting off focused on the imago, focused on the specular images, and then maybe towards the end where you're talking about this relationship between knowledge and truth, and specifically maybe more talking about feminine jouissance, that there is more of a movement into the real. What I'd be interested to know your take on this sort of a chronological understanding of Lacan, and specifically where we find the écrit.
That's great. Yeah. I think it generally holds that in most Lacanian, if you run conceptual histories through Lacan's work. So for instance, Jacques-Alain Miller has a great little talk on paradigms of jouissance, and he identifies 6, and he really tracks these 6 approaches to jouissance that you see at different periods in Lacan's career. What I was just describing, for instance, is paradigm number 5. But according to Miller, and I think it's precisely correct, you can take a lot of Lacanian concepts and you can walk them through his career and see very different definitions at different stages of his thought. And that's partly why it's important to stick with Lacan. It's also partly why it's extremely difficult to give a definition of jouissance. For instance, people always want to know, like, what is enjoyment? What is jouissance? And yeah, you can rattle off some quick and easy definitions, but it depends on which Lacan you're talking about, because that is a concept that changed dramatically throughout Lacan's career. And you could say the same of several other concepts in Lacan's thought, key concepts. Generally speaking, though, I think the trajectory that you laid out, imaginary, symbolic, real, holds. And not just across Lacan's career, where he starts with the imaginary, really peaks, I think, in his thinking with the symbolic, and then ends with discussions of the real. And that last transition from the symbolic to the real, I think, is a quite important one, because what you see is a shift in Lacan's thought from tropology that you saw in like his 50s and early 60s work, metaphor and metonymy being tropes, into topology, which is where you start getting into the knots and the diagrams and the Mobius strip forward in Lacan's later work around the real. And I think that is a really important way to mark this important shift from the symbolic to the real in Lacan's thought. The imaginary, I think, is the easiest to understand. Things get difficult when he starts trying to make use of structural linguistics and things in the 1950s, but I also believe that they become fundamentally important. And so for me, if you want Lacan's hot take on the symbolic, it's in the field and the function essay, this manifesto of psychoanalysis. That's really where Lacan lays out what it would be like to be a post-Freudian Lacanian psychoanalyst as he sees it in the 1950s. It's a manifesto. I think that one's terrific. However, I believe that the best essay, you've probably heard me say this before, is the subversion and the subject essay. If I could take the écrit and someone were to tell me, listen, bro, you got to pick one essay from this book and the rest we're going to burn in the stove, I would pick the subversion of the subject essay. I believe there is more crucial Lacanian thought in that essay than anywhere else in all of his work. And that includes the seminars, that includes the other texts, the other écrits, but I think that's really the centerpiece. And that's why when I started lectures on Lacan, I started it with a, I don't know, like 24-hour lecture commentary just on the subversion of the subject essay. And it was wild too, because the institution that invited me to do that, this is before lectures on Lacan, I was just a professor doing stuff. They invited me to come down and deliver this like 2-day seminar introducing Lacanian psychoanalysis to 70 or 80 PhD students in clinical psychology. Most of them, mind you, were fucking Jungians. The amount of pushback that I got from folks was fascinating as we were walking through this very key text in the ÉCRITS, the subversion of the subject essay. The result is a series of lectures, a 3-part series that's on our YouTube channel. It's also available in podcast form. I don't think it's the best reading of the subversion of the subject essay. In fact, I reread that essay once a year. That's partly what I mean by stick-with-itness, willpower, and idiocy. You have to know that the marks you put in that text, when read a year later, you're going to look at that and be like, what fucking idiot read this and then underlined that passage? So one of my tips for reading ÉCRITS, do not read it with a pen, read it with a pencil. Because the next time you go back through and read that text, you want to be able to erase the marks of the idiot that you were before and add the marks of a new idiot, the idiot that you have become, right? Where the old idiot was, the new idiot must become. And you just keep doing that. So unfortunately, I didn't have that sensibility when I was first going through ÉCRITS the first few times. And so I've got one copy full of ink, and then I've got another copy that's less full of ink. But that subversion of the subject essay, ooh-wee, there's a lot of marking in there, years of marking in that essay. It's a terrific piece. And that's the thing about reading the ÉCRITS. Your first time through any given one of these essays is going to be wildly different from your second, your third, and your fourth. That's part of why I compare it to a book of really sound, sophisticated, contemporary poetics. I read the American poetics, but American poetry today, you can read a book now and then 2 weeks later read it again, these little bit, even a chapbook. And the world opens up anew each time. That's the mark of a good text. Not how smart is it, but how many times can you read it and still have your world crack open anew? The ÉCRITS is a terrific text for y'all to be focusing on because that's exactly what it does. It's the kind of text you can go back to time and time again and learn something new. And I think the hot spot in that text is the subversion of the subject essay. And that really, I think, is where you see Lacan's thought on imaginary, symbolic, and real coming together. All of his work on the real is not quite formulated at that point, but a lot of his sensibilities around topics that verge on the real, that are informed by the real, is there. So I say when you come to that piece, zero in, and you'll see the very trajectory that you're mapping here, imaginary, symbolic, and real. But again, the trick is what you read after ÉCRITS. And I think those mid to late 1960s seminars are really great places to get started. Now, don't get me wrong. In seminar 10, Lacan is already shifting to the real. So I think you can see, if you really want to mark out these periods in his career, you can see the symbolic as a central theme giving way to the real as early as seminar 10 on anxiety. I mean, that's really what he's doing with Objet there, is that it takes on an aspect of the real. Anyway, that's a long answer to a terrific question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I mean, it's certainly sort of, I'm getting these sort of interesting connections with what you said about, the essay on, the essay subverting the subject of knowledge, that you would save that of all the other writings that Lacan had. It reminded me of a question that Richard Feynman was asked, actually, about if he could save one piece of information to leave for a human civilization, if we were going to lose all information, he said he would save the information of atomism. Just there's this sentence in Atom. He said he would preserve, but and then I just had that image come to my mind when you were talking about what essay would you preserve of Lacan. And it's an interesting thing is, if you just had that essay that you were saying of Lacan, could we rebuild Lacanian psychoanalysis from that essay? That's what I was thinking. Because
that's such a great question. That's a great question. I'd have to think about that.
Because Feynman was saying maybe we could rebuild civilization with atomism, but I was thinking, could we rebuild Lacan from that essay? And also, it was interesting thinking about again this this idea of idiocy. Is I was often taken when I was starting to learn Zizek's philosophy that he would often say there's two types of people: there's idiots and there's not total idiots. So we get this idea, I think, informed by Lacanian psychoanalysis, that we're no longer have this great man of knowledge, this great man of self-consciousness. We have basically a field of idiots and not total idiots, and we can get better at being idiots, perhaps. So, the more we expose ourselves to perhaps not just psychoanalysis, but just maybe the day-to-day workings of the unconscious and awareness of the unconscious in our speech and primarily with the other.
That's a really good point. Now, I know that's something that you're interested in, is addressivity and the other. You brought this up in terms of like, what would it mean to address these texts? Who are these texts addressed to? I mean, a lot of them are lectures that are being republished here. And so they had specific audiences. So the Subversion of the Subject essay had a very specific audience at the time. But any great writer, Lacan has in mind multiple audiences, including audiences that he couldn't even imagine, eavesdroppers still to come.
Well, you mentioned a little bit, I like that you were talking about the difficulty of defining clearly some of Lacan's core concepts, just because they go through such a conceptual transformation. I like that Alenka Zupancic, for example, said about the death drive that we should think about that as kind of an ongoing construction site. There are a few concepts that come to mind that maybe we should think of as ongoing construction sites, but one in particular that came up in your readings of the overlooked essays in the ÉCRITS, because I don't think Subversion of the Subject falls into that category, but some of the overlooked essays, one of them was on my antecedents. Yeah. And in that article, you bring up this distinction between pleasure and jouissance. Mm-hmm. And the example you use is pleasure is eating, jouissance is overeating. And I just resonated with that example because I can also I struggle with that, on a daily basis. I always wonder, what is that little part of me that just is not satisfied with eating? I have to overeat. No, I can keep it at bay, but I have to accept it and affirm it in some sense, but and I'm not saying that example exhausts the difference between pleasure and jouissance, but it would be interesting to me if we could go into that distinction a little bit, because it seems to me to be very central for Lacan, and specifically the way in which Lacan's choosing to engage with Freud. Mm-hmm. As at this juncture, it seems to me like Lacan is very much interacting with Freud at this distinction between Freud before Beyond the Pleasure Principle and after Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where there's all sorts of conceptual theoretical mess that comes out in the International Psychoanalytic Association.
Yeah, I can tell that 1920 book by Freud is an impactful one for you. And I think it is. I think Beyond the Pleasure Principle is a really crucial text of his. And in that text, as everybody well knows, you see him really sorting through this question, the question that would become the basis for object relations and all the way up into attachment theory of, like, if we are just pleasure-seeking animals, why do we spend so much time crossing the limits of pleasure and entering into this world of pain repetitively? Like nightly, like each meal, there's always that bite where you're like, you know what, I'm going to finish this. I feel you, brother. I'm from the Midwest of the United States, and we're all part of the Clean Plate Club, and for better and for worse. So there's always that challenge of letting it go, of letting the shit go into the sink instead of putting it in my face. And I think that's a little bit of a dilemma. I remember actually, I knew a guy once, it was the first person I'd ever met in my life, who systematically, purposefully, and almost unconsciously always left a single bite of food on his plate. And I asked him about that once. I said, bro, like, why would you do that? Aren't you just one more bite, just finish it? And he said, no, it's not polite. I said, what do you mean it's not polite? He told me he was raised on the East Coast of the United States, New York, I think. He said that part of what he was raised to believe was that leaving that one little morsel of food on the plate was an indication that you could pass beyond this limit and into something else, but you don't, that you demonstrate a kind of restraint. And it was stunning to me how proud he was of that moment. And I just couldn't help but, looking back, realize just how much he enjoyed telling me about his ability to resist the field of enjoyment known as jouissance. And so this partly gets into discussions around the way people, neurotics especially, learn to enjoy their symptoms. But it also gets at some, I think, a really nice Lacanian point, which is that jouissance is prohibited. And nevertheless, we find ways to access it. The renunciation of jouissance is what gives us access to a certain type of surplus enjoyment. And one of the surplus enjoyments available to us is the way that we can learn to enjoy our deprivations of enjoyment. And so this could be somebody, for instance, who there was dessert served last night, and you said, no, I'm too full, I can't do it. And then the next day you show up at work and you brag to everybody how proud you are that you were able to resist, and you kind of fold your arms and you're like, yeah, motherfucker, I'm rounding the corner here. And I think the Lacanian point there is that you can get off on ways of preventing yourself from getting off. You have deprived yourself of dessert, prevented yourself from passing into that field of having eaten too much. But then that renunciation of enjoyment itself becomes something to be enjoyed, a new way of accessing enjoyment. That's where we're always trending, is toward ways of accessing enjoyment, not the prohibited kind, but all the different supplemental or surplus enjoyments that are afforded by that foundational prohibition. And I think eating is a really good example of this, especially around overeating. That's partly why I queued up that example. Pleasure is what happens when you are full. But what we know about a full belly is that it eventually goes away and hunger returns in the very same way that desire always returns. Overeating is absolutely going beyond a certain limit, a limit known as pleasure, and puts us into this field of pleasure at an extreme, verging on pain. And that's a different ball game, but it's a really important one because it's how many of us access enjoyment. So notice how this sequence unfolds too. So you overeat, you feel like shit afterwards, your clothes don't fit, you feel disgusting, you're frustrated. Remember, enjoyment isn't pleasure. You don't like enjoyment in many cases, nor do I. It's discomforting. And then the next day, your superego kicks in and you have to go to the gym and basically beat the hell out of yourself. And the more pain and suffering that you endure at the gym, the more you redeem yourself from overeating the night before. And then you spend the rest of the next 2 days grunting and groaning every time you sit down in a chair because you're so sore from the workout. And you're so sore from the workout that redeemed yourself from overeating, such a powerful workout that you might not go to the gym or on your jog the following couple of days. You might, in fact, reward yourself a little bit. Oh, I'm too tired to cook. I hit the gym too hard. Let's order pizza instead. And so it doesn't take much imagination to start figuring a cycle in which pleasure is always transgressed, leaving you in a state of jouissance that is uncomfortable, that awakens further instances of jouissance as discomfort. And you can just get going on that cycle. I don't think this is the most profound way to understand what Lacan is doing with jouissance. It does, however, capture a good amount of what it is to experience pleasure. Pleasure is comfort. Pleasure is repose. Pleasure is the path of least resistance. Pleasure
reduction of tension.
That's right. That's the classic Freudian sense. Yep. Jouissance, though, means many different things. In relation to pleasure, though, what I'm trying to suggest is that it is typically associated with something that is occurring beyond pleasure, beyond the pleasure principle, and putting us into a field of discomfort. And I think that's a very terrific place to start thinking about enjoyment. Because what it allows, I mean, I get this a lot. It's a question that comes up often. Because wait a minute, in English, pleasure and enjoyment, these sound like the same thing. Isn't this what we're talking about? Isn't this the same thing? No, it's not the same thing. The first way to understand enjoyment is around pain and around discomfort. And I think once you start there, you're on the path to understanding jouissance in many other different ways. But it first has to be sundered from pleasure as this kind of comfort, ease, repose, minimal tension, as you put it. I mean, this is the classic Freudian sense that we are these homeostatic organisms, these tea kettles. So pleasure is a tea kettle whose contents are the same temperature as the kitchen in which the tea kettle sits, right? Pleasure is what happens when in the summer, the soil heats up and your corpse corresponds. And in the winter, the soil cools down and freezes. So also does your corpse. That like homeostatic relation to one's environment, where there's no tension between the temperature of your corpus and the temperature of your Umfeld, is what we mean by pleasure. And as soon as you start getting discrepancies between those two things, you start verging into the field of enjoyment, in the field of jouissance. And that becomes a much richer question, a question around all the ways that we enjoy states of tension, intensifications of the human form. And that's really what we mean by affect. Affect is an intensification of the corporal form that marks a distinction or a disjunction between the way you feel as a body and the world around you. But anyway, I don't want to get too Heideggerian with this thing, because really just wanted to emphasize that you can start with pleasure, push past that into jouissance, and really be on a Lacanian trajectory to understanding some pretty complex forms of human experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, what's coming to my mind is that if you just take almost anything that humans find pleasurable and you just think about repeating that thing without end, at a certain point, the field is going to become not only painful, but potentially even nightmarish. You know, like you take your favorite thing, you know, the slice of pizza, whatever it is that you really got a pleasurable kick from, or whatever you go to that's perhaps something that reduces tension or gets that little bit of comfort.
That's right.
You just repeat that. At a certain point, it turns to a nightmare.
Yep.
and I think that's and I like also, I appreciate definitely the way you're articulating jouissance as related to states of tension and intensifications, because, you know, I think one of the crucial transitions from Freud to Lacan, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but one of the crucial transitions between Freud and Lacan is the way Freud perhaps didn't really understand what he discovered with the death drive, in the sense that he thought that the death drive was somehow linked to the nirvana principle or the release from tension completely, you know, death. But actually there's a paradox in the death drive, or however we want to talk about it, which is it's not the end of tension, but potentially playing around with intensifications of tension. One of the examples, I don't remember the quote exactly, but Lacan was talking about the way in which the difference between animals and humans with food is that animals do not know the enjoyment of hunger. In other words, some humans can get intensifications, increased states of tension, let's say, by playing around with fasting or something like that. And fasting becomes, let's say, a spiritual object. Well, I can fast 24 hours. I can fast 48 hours. And that's playing around with a certain tension of hunger as opposed to a reduction of tension. So I think in some sense with this model of the mind, we get into a zone of subjective production of its object, which verges on the extremes of spiritual practices, spiritual processes, which is a very unique window and something that I think Lacan touches on quite a bit. Yeah, any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Lacan asks a really great question in seminar 17. If you've got the English translation, you can track it down here. It's pages 176 to 177. And it harkens back to a comment he made almost precisely 100 pages earlier on page 77 of this text. It's a famous passage that you may have heard around the lilies in the field and the plant's jouissance. And then he comes up on 177 and wants to ask this question around what jouissance is. And he gets back into talking about plants, beavers, oysters, and fill in the blank. And I think these are great passages to read around this topic. So if you just hear me out on this, starting with page 77. It is true that we can well imagine the lily in the fields as a body entirely given over to jouissance, each stage of its growth identical to a formless sensation, the plant's jouissance. Nothing in any case makes it possible to escape it. It is perhaps infinitely painful to be a plant. Well, nobody amuses themselves by thinking about this except me. Now, on page 77 of Seminar 17, when Lacan is riffing on this stuff, I like it because you can hear the biblical reference, the birds and the lilies of the fields, but also you can hear Lacan at what I believe to be his fluid best, namely whenever he is talking about plants or animals. Lacan is the guy who, if he were still around today, would be on Animal Planet all day long. All he would be, his entire Instagram feed would be like full of like otters and, all these different animal feeds. He'd be watching all the abnormalities and strangenesses that happen in nature. I think he's at his liquid best when thinking about birds, bees, fish, any
Ostriches.
Ostriches, non-human animals is really where this guy's at. And that's what he's saying here is nobody amuses themselves by thinking about this except me. But the point that he's making is whatever it is that the plant is experiencing, the oyster or the beaver, which he comes to on 177, we have no fucking idea. And his point here is that you can't call that jouissance. That's not jouissance. Jouissance is reserved for someone who, as the example you just offered, can fast. And that's what he gets at in the second passage I want to share with you. The key lies in raising the question of what jouissance is, he says on page 176, about 100 pages later. It is well and truly as bound to the very origin of the signifiers coming into play. And that's the key distinction. There are many, many signifiers in nature, but they do not amount to a language in the way that they do for a human being. It is well and truly as bound to the very origin of the signifiers coming into play that it is possible to speak of jouissance, he says on page 177 of Seminar 17. And remember, I offer this as an invitation so that folks after the écrit can know where to turn next. Seminar 16 is a basket. You can check our series on 16 for help. Seminar 17, I think, is still a very accessible text. And these pages, 77 and 177, come pretty close to getting at that question that you're asking, my friend, around the spiritual practices, for instance, of fasting and the types of jouissance afforded by those practices. Nobody will ever know anything about what the oyster or the beaver enjoys, because in the absence of the signifier, there is no distance between jouissance and the body. The oyster and the beaver are at the same level as the plant, which after all, perhaps may have jouissance at this level. And he goes on and on. But the point here is that it's the signifier and its relation to us as subjects that allows us to take those spatializing moves that would allow fasting to occur, for instance. And that's a big difference. Jouissance is what occurs in the wake of the signifier. It can only be in the wake of the signifier. If there ain't signifiers in there, in other words, mediations between jouissance and the body, there ain't going to be any jouissance. And so the lizard on the rock in the Heideggerian sense, the oyster, the beaver, the plant in the Lacanian sense, These are not beings toward jouissance. We, however, are, because so much of our lives are mediated through the defiles of the signifier. And that's a great Lacanian insight, and one to hold in mind whenever we're thinking about jouissance in relation to pleasure and the like. Jouissance is available to us only because we have access to language, the symbolic, a field in which prohibition reigns supreme. And that is how you get pleasure as well. Pleasure is always this point at which, to quote you, you would stop repeating the experience. So I like pizza. That was one of your examples, right? And, you know, I go to
It's also true.
It's also very true. And so, you know, but at some point you have to push pause and say, okay, that's the last piece of pizza I'm going to eat, and I'm full and I'm happy and I'm content. And then you sometimes go a little further. Pleasure, though, as a principle, is shackled to these prohibitive logics, these logics of thou shalt not go any further in your pizza eating. And to be a good subject, a civilized being, is to know when to stop. That knowledge is the same knowledge that my old friend practiced systematically. Whether he was hungry or not, he always left a bite on his plate. And that's pleasure at work. It always is working to maintain our relationships to limitation, to constraint, and to prohibition. It is a properly linguistic experience, this notion of pleasure. And yet, in the field of repetition, which I continue to believe to be the central concept in Lacan's late 60s thought, so after ÉCRITS, repetition becomes the central concept in his thought. Repetition, that same concept that troubled Freud in the 1920s book you mentioned, on Beyond the Pleasure Principle, it becomes this question of how does repetition work in time, the retroactive impulses built into repetition, and then also how does it carry us beyond pleasure? What's the role of repetition in knowledge, in jouissance, in relation to truth? It becomes this really hot, molten concept in Lacan's thought. And I like your question because it puts us right on the path of understanding repetition in relation to these other two key concepts, pleasure and jouissance. And I think you're precisely right to note that anything that brings you pleasure, if repeated past a certain point, is going to pass from pleasure into displeasure and into pain. And I think that's a really great foundational thought to have as folks start getting into Lacanian stuff and into thinking through his thoughts on jouissance after ÉCRITS is published.
Yeah, some really interesting images coming to my head there, and I think that was really helpful. What I'd like to focus on is, and I think you do focus on this throughout your lecture series as well, is this, and articulate it very clearly as well, is this relationship between jouissance and prohibition as constitutive of the symbolic field. I think that's super important because, you know, why, in some sense, is the method of psychoanalysis so important? That is the method of free association, which, you know, in one of the other overlooked essays in the ÉCRITS, Beyond the Reality Principle, he talks about free association as being composed of the law of non-omission and the law of non-systematization, which I think is very helpful to think about what free association is. You know, don't omit anything and don't privilege coherence and systematic thinking, right?
Yeah.
And in some sense, the ego, self-consciousness, it's based on a prohibition, it's based on omitting, and it's based on a certain structural logic, which I could explain in a narrative like, hi, my name's Cadell, I've gone to this and that school, and it explains a certain logical temporality, but all of that is suspended in free association. And I'd be interested to know why you think that's so important in regards to the relationship between jouissance and prohibition, and how we can, in some sense, get really knotted up in ourselves because of certain relationships, let's say between prohibition and jouissance, basically, being a discontented civilized subject in some sense, being a discontented good boy or girl.
Yeah, that's such a great dyad of questions there around the logic of free association and then jouissance. And I'm delighted to be here because this is my 10th day with COVID. This is the first time I've had COVID. It's totally interesting and fucking bizarre. I'm just starting to be able to smell again, to taste again. I've been doing like weird aromatherapeutic like techniques to try and like regain my sense of smell. I like this though, because I've also been kind of exploring my body in this period, like really just trying to feel the weight of my limbs, feeling weird pains in different areas. I haven't quite been able to like suss out my organs, if you will, but I have been able to like feel different pains and twinges in ways that I haven't been able to feel. COVID did a very interesting thing to me. The brain fog, though, is also real. And so I'm excited to be here because I want to find a kind of limit, and I want to bump up against it. And COVID is helping me find this limit in my ability to like process and think about things, and things I would usually come very, very quickly to mind are like more delayed and fogged out. And I offer this, first of all, as an apology for the incoherent answer that I'm about to give, but also as an illustration. I think that part of what happens in free association when it really starts working is there's a kind of ego fog that sets in. And now remember, I'm not that kind of doctor. I just play that kind of doctor on TV, or in this case, the internet. But in lectures on Lacan, part of why it works is because we have so many clinicians in the mix. And so I really wish that this was a group call and that some of the usual senior clinicians, Lacanians, that are in the mix with us could weigh in here about how free association operates and how this works. Let me see if I can paraphrase some of them, which, I mean, I can't do justice to the brilliance of these folks. But here's what I've heard in our discussions around the practice. It has a lot to do with listening for the unconscious and giving opportunities for it to speak. So the analyst is a very particular type of interlocutor that does a very good job of laying back, playing deaf, dumb, and foolish, and listening for opportunities when the ego gets a little bit foggy. Now, we typically refer to these opportunities or these openings in empty speech as parapraxes. There's the slip, there's the stutter, there's the stammer, there's something you would typically remember, but you have subsequently forgot. There are all these moments where the ego starts to stammer and break down, where that coherent narrative you presented about like, hi, I'm Cadell, I went to this university and that university, and here's my through line, and it all seems to make sense. The cracks that emerge at the level of speech in those moments are opportunities for this other, less coherent, absolutely, in fact, incoherent. The law of non-contradiction is out the window when Freud gets a hold of speech. And I think Lacan really, really wants this to be part and parcel of analytic technique, which is the reason why I emphasize reading Lacan like a musical score. So much of what Lacan is up to is around sound. Anytime Lacan thinks around technique, he usually has a sensory split between sound and smell. Poor analysts are oftentimes characterized as bloodhounds who are out there sniffing around for the truth of their analysans. A good analyst, though, listens to speech as though listening to a musical score in which there would be numerous instruments playing at the same time. And a good analyst can hear all the different instruments playing, even the one that's quiet. A good analyst can notice the kettle drum that is not being struck. In other words, what is silent in the musical score as well. And I think part of what I've heard from the analysts that attend our series and our discussions is that what you would be doing to inspire free association is listening for and trying whenever possible to draw out those silences and those mild incoherences, or sometimes major incoherences, and marking them in a way that allows them to also enter the conversation. This is, I think, how psychoanalysis is very different from psychotherapy. Psychotherapy will engage all parts of self. Psychotherapy is just as interested in hearing from you as a desirous ego as it is from hearing from you as an unconscious subject. Psychoanalysis, though, is more primarily interested in listening to you as an unconscious subject. So Bruce Fink has this great example in his clinical introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis, which I highly recommend for those in your group that are less inclined towards the literature philosophy end of Lacanian psychoanalysis and more thinking that clinical practice might be the thing for them. Bruce's intro is a very good one here. And he has this example, I believe, in that text of somebody who shows up and is talking about a movie they saw and how they were really disgusted by one of the characters in the movie who just did something horrible, and then says, that's definitely not the kind of partner I would want to have. And Bruce says in that moment, you're tempted to go to the analysand and say, oh, well, tell me more about the type of partner you would like to have. Because isn't that what brought you to therapy? Your failed relationships with others. Like, tell me more about what you want. In other words, let's talk about your desire. He thinks that's a trap. Instead, the question should be, tell me more about the person whom you found disgusting. What about them was so revolting? What about that particular character was so aversive to you? What part of that? In other words, less about what you want and more about your feelings of intense affective response to this other character in the film. And I think psychoanalysis focuses more on these moments of intense affect, oftentimes confusing affect that unfortunately we oftentimes label as anxiety. Oh, it was just anxiety. I mean, and then think back to what Heidegger says about anxiety. When anxiety shows up and you ask somebody, whoa, what the fuck was that? You just checked out for a minute. The person responds, oh, it was nothing. Heidegger's point is that is precisely what it was. You just bumped up against nothingness, motherfucker. And that's what's troubling you. But we have all these ways of dismissing these really profound existential moments when the world seems to crack open for a second. And we say, oh, I'm sorry, I was just tripping. On the West Coast, we talk about people be tripping. Somebody's just sorry, I was just tripping about that. And what that means, though, is that we are turning away from moments of disruption in our sense of self and world and focusing instead on getting back on track in the field of coherent speech. And analysis really wants to focus on those moments of disruption, especially as they emerge in speech, especially in analytic experience. And I think when you get to a level where you can free associate, you're so used to those interruptions and those blips and blunders that you're able to just let them flow. And that kind of flow, I can just tell you in my own analysis, I found it very rare to be able to go into a free associative moment and just really just let it all fly. And I think that it's an earned experience. I think that it is a trained capacity, if you will. And I think that it's incredibly important. And the reason why it's challenging, and this brings us to the second part of your question around prohibition and jouissance, is that part of what it means to be a subject is to be prohibited, is to be subjected to a world of norms, codes, and expectations that from the start have been rewarding our ego and silencing the less coherent parts of us. And so people often ask, why does psychoanalysis take so long? Why does it take so long? Why are people in analysis for years? Mine took, I think, 8 years. Why does it take so long to do this work? Well, for the same reason it takes a very long time to change a habit. In order to change a habit, you have to act differently as many times as you acted to create that habit. That's a lot of actions. Habits take time to change. And I think free association is this earned capacity. is something that takes a lot of time because you're constantly butting up against the limitations and the constraints that society has imposed on us. And those impositions, though, at the same time, are precisely what allow us to exist. It's a good thing to be constrained by the symbolic. And if you don't believe me, ask any non-florid psychotic.
Yeah, that was really good. And what was coming to my mind there was in regards to why does it take so long? Also that question I think is also coming from a place in perhaps psychotherapy and perhaps some other regions where the goal is how can we get you back to work as quickly as possible. The goal is not I'm going to labor through incoherent and perhaps uncomfortable speech, to say the least, in a certain abyssal way where there's no guarantee of what the end result will be or what this other repetition, this other mode of being might be on the other side of undoing certain symptomal formations. But I was thinking in regards to why does it take so long is quite some powerful aspects of the ecrit, and I think it's in some more major essays, but also I think you bring it up in the standards of treatment. I think it's variations on the standard treatment, it's called, where basically the ego has all of these fantasies of completion because it's coming from feelings of an impotent body and the conditions of being an infant. And this is, to me, what's so powerful is the way Lacan focuses and always engages anthropology, even engages primatology, examples of the relationship between humans and chimpanzees in the mirror image. But that we are born in such an uncoordinated, such a impotent state of being largely as a, if you watch, like, for example, you say Lacan I like that idea. Lacan will be watching certain maybe Instagram reels of nature.
Yeah, you bet.
You see some really funny things there. But if you watch, for example, a gazelle being born, they just are born and they hop out and they're running right away. They just stumble for a few seconds and then they're running right away. Whereas with a human being, we've got maybe 2 years of work before we get you up and running there, and then we still got some work to do, so right. It's and it's, I like, actually, there was a part of your lecture series I quite liked where you were thinking about what it might be like to be an infant, and you were like, it's probably pretty terrifying to be an infant. And I was like, yeah, that's probably true. Because and things that you wouldn't expect to be terrifying as an adult, you don't know, because as an infant, so much surprise and novelty is coming at you everywhere you go, and so much is unexplained, so much is potentially disturbing to you, right? But I just want to talk a little bit of, maybe if I could get you to talk a little bit about this impotent starting condition of the body, the uncoordinated state of the body, and the specular images of omnipotence that the ego and that as certain underlying reason why it's so difficult to really go through analysis, why it might take so long, because like you were saying, to undo a habit takes as long. Well, we're dealing with a habit which was forming from infancy.
Yeah, the habit's called subjectivity.
The habit is called you.
Yeah, exactly. All of this, I'll come to the question in a second, but it reminds me of what I think the horizon for analytic experience is. And I don't think not everybody needs psychoanalysis. I think that you can arrive at many of the insights that come with the end of analysis through other spiritual traditions. I think the type of, for instance, self-compassion that certain psychologists advocate for, think Kristen Neff, Chris Germer, and these folks, lines up pretty well with the self-relating that would be afforded by a successful Lacanian psychoanalysis. And that an ability to sit with one's impotence, one's limitations, with what in Lacanian psychoanalysis we call one's castration. An ability to sit with and accept that is fundamentally key. And in fact, it's what puts us on the path not of desire, but of the drive. An ability to sit with the lack that we are, sit with the cracks in our being, not in an effort to fill them up. That's desire at its limit with surplus enjoyment. The drive, though, is about sitting with openings in oneself, not trying to close them and not trying to be them, but instead an effort to have them. I have limitations. And that part of analysis that comes at the end, I think is so key to keeping one's drive alive. That ability to sit with the lack that we are, which is why in one of my last series, I emphasize with the question of the drive is not what we do mit dem Trieben, as Freud put it, like what we do with the drives, but our ability to be there with mit Dasein, the drives, and the openings that condition them. Now, I don't want to go too far down that because, you know, it's available out there. You could track it down, but it's important here because that impotence that we learn to love, this love of weakness that Lacan talks about in the early 1970s, is a love of the type of weakness that we were thrown into when we were born. You see, Lacan's point about the fragmented body at the level of the infant, which etymologically means without speech. The infant, the infans, is one who is always on the verge of death. We think of a child born as being on the threshold of life. Their life has just begun. They're ready to be this individual, soon to be subjectivated. No. For Lacan, the fragmented body that is the fourth trimester or that 2-year window that you cited, this is a body that is tinged with death. This is a body that is always on the verge of expiring. You see, you can take a human body that is born and you can put it in the corner of the room and you can come back in a minute, an hour, or a week, and that baby will still be there. The infant lacks the fine and gross motor skills that a gazelle, as you put it, would have. It can't just get up and follow you around. It requires copious amounts of care from others. And yet at the same time, no matter how much care that body receives, it's going to perish. It's going to die. And this, for me, if you want an ontology of psychoanalysis, and I don't believe that one exists, by the way. If you've heard my lectures, you know I believe in meontology. Psychoanalysis works because it is a science of non-being. But if you want some like columns or pistons, if you want a philosophical anthropology out of psychoanalysis, I think it amounts to this. In order to be human, you have to have a body. It doesn't have to look like mine or yours. It doesn't have to have arms, but you have to be embodied to be human. That body, in order to survive past a certain point, has to receive care from others, not just care from mothers, but care from others, copious amounts of care. So care becomes a really important part of this philosophical anthropology. And yet, even the body that survives, you and I on this call, we could only be here because the bodies into which we were born received lots of care to get us past that point where we can now do things on our own. If we didn't receive that care, we wouldn't be here because we'd be dead. And yet, even the body that receives adequate care, all care is fucked up, but adequate care is going to die. And I think that loop between the impotence of the fragmented body at birth in infancy and this love of weakness, this love of impotence, this love of truth. It's a love of truth because truth is impotent. Truth for Lacan can never be fully stated. It can only ever be half stated. So those who speak the truth are always speaking from positions of incapacity, impotentiality, impotence. This love of weakness is a love of what you can say about who you are. about what matters in this world, about the kindness that needs to be rendered to self and other, but also a love of the limitations that come with that experience. We can only say so much. Love gets bound up in this. Love for Lacan means giving what one doesn't have. Love of weakness is the very truth of what it means to love in the Lacanian sense. I love the parts of you that don't work. I don't just love the parts that serve me, that make me feel X, Y, or Z form of completion. I love the parts of you that are a little fucked up too. I love the parts of you of which you are unaware, and vice versa. So there's a sense in Lacan that the end of analysis is an embrace and an ability to love and sit with the type of bodily fragmentation that we all endured in this state of infancy. And then from that capacity, we can be with others in ways that are radically generous, radically kind. And I would submit that most of the other spiritual traditions that could bring you to this insight without going through years of psychoanalysis, when you start asking these folks what it all amounts to, it fundamentally amounts to kindness. It's really about being kind to oneself as the condition of possibility for learning how to love others. And I think this is right on point with what Lacan gives us as this notion of the end of analysis. What's great about it, though, is that it links right back up to his earlier thinking about the terrific, in many ways, state of bodily fragmentation that an infant finds themselves in. Now, establishing all of that does not answer your question about omnipotence and the ways that we are tempted with fantasies of completion, which really is the fundamental fantasy of wholeness, completion, and consistency. We fantasize about that because we don't know it at all. In fact, what we know, what we live with is inconsistency, incompletion, fragmentation, limitation, all the things that the ego tries to ignore, but that each of us know deep in our bones is the truth. And you don't have to have COVID to come to that insight. For me, though, it's top of mind in this 10th day of my COVID-19 to really be here and sit with my incapacity. Now, I promised you some foggy brain answers, and I hope this rises to that level because I'm eager always to find my limits, not in order to transgress them, but in order to be with them, to hold them. And I think that's a really important part of what the adult at the end of analysis can do that the child at the start of their life cannot.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. And there's so many different points there that I think point me in. Well, first, let me say, I really like the way both in your lectures and just now you articulate the baby, the infant, as actually a being on the verge of death, not a being at the start of life. I think it's a really nice point. I think it sits with me as true in the sense that an infant, especially in the first year of life, has to be in the care of the other constantly. You know, there's no gap here. Any gap, any gap could result in death. So it literally is on the verge of death.
Yes.
Right. And that's perhaps unique in the whole of the animal kingdom, in the sense of a being on the verge of death for that long.
That's really
right?
fascinating.
You know, well, I'm so actually funny enough, as an undergrad, my first training was as a primatologist. So I was bringing up that point about humans and chimps because that was my first fascination was humans and chimps, and the maternal caregiving time period between chimpanzees and humans gets enormously expanded. And even among the great apes, even among the primates, chimpanzees have an extended care period. So the fact that with humans it gets even that much more extended is largely attributed in the literature to the growth of our neocortex, and the fact that we have to be born prematurely in some sense. And I like also that you use the language of the fourth trimester, which is another thing that's quite powerful. But I also think it was quite powerful the way you were linking psychoanalysis to the spiritual traditions, and that there is some sort of unity here with this coming to an acceptance of limits of impotence, and being able to sit with that. In psychoanalytic terms, it seems to me like it's like you say, sitting with castration, and accepting castration. And that there's a newfound capacity to love. What I always dislike about certain, not spiritual religious traditions as such, but of certain subjects of religious and spiritual traditions, is that they'll use this discourse as a power game, right? And I guess that can happen in any field, right? It can happen in any field where, I often think some of the ideas of Christianity are fantastic, but I don't see it embodied in the Christians, let's say, or something like that. Something like that. Some paradox of, and these paradoxes abound in science as well. I often make fun of, for example, the doctor who's telling you to eat better, but he's overweight or something like that, or the doctor who knows everything about the stomach but can't sit with his own stomach, or something like that.
Isn't that how it is, though?
There's always these paradoxes that you can find there, but in your lecture, and now because of some of the things you've been saying in our talk, I wanted to ask you about this, but then I wanted to add this extra thing from what you've been saying is, you say that psychoanalysis and this question of the end of analysis, has something to do with being able to embody the point of view of death, coming to that point of view of death that might even use the language that being towards death. You also said in this talk, we have that humans are unique among animals of also a being towards jouissance. But I was wondering what you think about the end of analysis and a being towards death, and the potential links between Lacan and Heidegger, because you've mentioned Heidegger a few times as well, and see where we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just finished lecturing on this topic. In fact, one of the final lectures in the series I just completed on Seminar 17 is around this topic of being toward death. And not from me, but because Lacan cues it up at the end when he's talking about love of weakness, love of impotence. I'm actually giving a follow-up lecture in Iran, albeit through virtual means in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned and you'll get some more of the love of weakness stuff. But Lacan himself brings up this notion of being toward death. I think, in fact, it's arguably the most central Heideggerian concept in Lacan's thought, is this notion of being toward death. It's absolutely fundamental to what Lacan is doing around resubjectivization, around retroaction in the 1950s. In fact, the bread and butter essay from the 1950s, this Field and Function Manifesto of Psychoanalysis, is one in which historicity and Heidegger and being toward death, I believe, also come up. It's throughout Lacan's thought, and he's not alone. Foucault learned a lot also about being toward death and the type of ethics in the present that imagining oneself on one's deathbed allows. What you also get in connecting Heidegger and Lacan in this tradition is an emphasis on future anteriority. And that tense is very important, I think, for understanding how being toward death figures in Lacan's thought, much the same as it figures in Heidegger's thought before him. And you can't forget either that in the 1950s, Lacan and Heidegger are linked up. Now, the relationship doesn't end well, but Lacan is going to visit Heidegger, and Heidegger is coming to France to visit Lacan. They're not just reading each other's work, they're knowing each other personally. And I think it was probably more of a one-way relationship. I think Heidegger was not as interested in Lacan as the other way around. And I think Lacan read and studied and did more work with Heidegger's thought than Heidegger ever did with Lacan's. So I think it's fair to say all that. Lacan thought much higher of Heidegger than the other way around. I think, in fact, the relationship ends with Heidegger coming to the conclusion that the great psychoanalyst himself could use a little therapy. But being towards death, conceptually speaking, in the field of intellectual history, is part of what unites these two figures. And that tense will have been, the future anterior, is very key to understanding how it is to be towards death. Heidegger is not talking about perishing. He's not talking about demise. He's not talking about biological death when he talks about being towards death. He's talking about an ability to imagine oneself on one's deathbed from the vantage point in which one now finds oneself in the present. So you imagine yourself on your deathbed looking back at a life that will have been. And you ask yourself, do I have any regrets? Well, folks I know who work in end-of-life situations, they oftentimes tell me that their patients have a lot of regrets. And they regret, for instance, that they're now too old to travel. I wish I would have traveled more when I was younger. I wish I would have fallen in love with a French woman in graduate school and the rest becoming my history. I wish I would have taken that leap. I wish I would have, I mean, it's simple shit too. I wish I would have eaten more adventurously. I wish I would have tried different foods. Often, I wish I would have spent more time with my family. And now they're all gone. Now they don't like me. Now they don't want to see me anymore. I wish I would have invested more in my children and less in my career. Very few people get to the end of life and wish they had spent more time at the office. But they have regrets. Being towards death is a way of living in the present that ensures that you'll have minimum regrets at the end of your life. Because if you imagine yourself on your deathbed looking back on your present, and you ask yourself, what of my present right now in 50 years and 40 years is going to have been a big deal? You get enormous clarity on what it means to live a life today. So for instance, it's, pretty early in the month of August as we're having this call. I imagine a few people towards the end of July were scrambling to get that rent check together. In 30 or 40 years, looking back, you are not going to remember the scramble that you endured in July 25th, 27th range, 2023 as being a big deal in your life. On the contrary, you wouldn't think of that as a blip at all, even in the radar, from the vantage point of a 40-year deathbed experience. Heidegger's point, and Lacan's as well, Foucault's as well, around being towards death is, if in 40 years you're not going to sweat that moment, don't fucking sweat it now. If, however, in 40 years you would have scrambled to make that rent check and done something illegal that perhaps got you arrested and put you in the slammer, then you can think, okay, that is a big deal. I shouldn't fucking do that. The trick in being towards death is imagining yourself in the outer limit of our capacity to exist. And then ask yourself, what type of life is worth living in the meantime, between the now in which I imagine that impossible though necessary future and the future in which it arrives. It's all about learning how to live today rather than some morbid, nihilistic experience pegged to one's death in the future. No, it just means that to love weakness, to love impotence, is to also love the fact that at some point, typically beyond your ability to predict, this life will come to an end. And the love of that ultimate weakness known as death is what allows us to then look back and think about what it means to live a life. And this is part of what is integral to keeping the drive alive, is also recognizing that there will be a point beyond which you cannot pass, a point in which your only passage is back into the earth. And embracing that is not morbid. It's not nihilistic. It's not defeatist. It's not pessimistic. In fact, it's the condition of possibility for hope, because it allows you, with that deep perspective, to look at your life today and be like, okay, what really fucking matters? I can run the circuit right now, and I can look around my life and I can say, in 40 years, this is going to be the important stuff. reading and studying Lacan for me right now is a very meaningful thing for me. It brings me lots of joy and excitement. I think in 40 years, I will be happy that I spent this amount of time doing things like this interview, hosting lecture series. I mean, bear in mind, I'm a professor. I teach classes at San Francisco State, give lectures around, publish books and shit like that. Lacan is kind of like a service that I provide. All I want to do is to be able to help clinicians be better at what they do. And if that means helping them understand some Lacan, I'll do whatever I can. I'm happy to assist. It's meaningful for me. I'm not going to become a clinician, but working with them, I've learned so much, had so much fun. And I continue to believe that in 40 years, that will be a meaningful experience for me. Being a father is a meaningful experience to me. I prioritize that because I know in 40 years, it will have been one of the great aspects of my life. Being a partner, being a friend, exercising, smelling the air when my COVID clears, little things like that, that I know in 40 years are going to be a priority. The things that I will remember will be those little things that mattered today. But I think being towards death is what provides that opportunity. You imagine yourself on your deathbed looking back on your present and you ask, okay, what part of my present is most important right now? And it helps you gain perspective on all of these things. So for instance, in 40 years, my parents will both be dead. My step-parents will all be dead. Does that mean that I now should prioritize spending time with them? At some point, the logic of being towards death is as simple as that. Nothing lasts forever, so enjoy it while you can. The real question is, what type of enjoyment are we talking about here? And I would suggest it is the type of enjoyment that we refer to as drive satisfaction, learning how to accept the things that bring you joy. But I don't want to go too far with that. I don't want to go too far because I get started down this path and I can't quite come back.
Well, I think we've still gone a fair ways into that, let's call it that death image. And the powerful way that that death image can bring structure, can bring meaning to your temporality as a subject, and like you ended there with this idea of drive satisfaction. What it's reminding me of is there's this clip of Lacan on death on YouTube where he's very angry, and he's talking to the students, and he's like he's saying, death. Like how like you should be grateful that you're all going to die. How could you bear life if you weren't going to die? Right? It's like, this idea that a fantasy of an immortal life. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like the way the ego the ego's fantasies are kind of nightmarish in the end, like because if you imagine living forever, because the ego doesn't want to die.
Yeah. Yes.
Well,
exactly.
that would be a nightmare if
Yes.
you're actually, and if you were saying, and imagine if you had that the genie, you have 3 wishes and one of your wishes was I want to live forever. You might be condemning yourself to the worst possible existence to do that. So it just brings again in that perspective that gratefulness and the ways in which you can embed your, let's say, your drive satisfaction within a meaningful temporal horizon.
That's the reality right there, man. You said it best. Yeah.
I do have a question about jouissance and what you were talking about there in terms of meaning and family and parents and child. Has your perspective on some of these things changed going into fatherhood versus being on the other side of fatherhood?
It has, in fact. At being the typical nerd that I am, when I found out that my partner was pregnant, the mother of my daughter, I immediately thought, okay, I need to learn how to be a dad. So the first thing I did was I called my brother. He's a great father. And I asked him, what do I do? How do I do this? He said, oh, it's simple. Don't worry about it. If the baby cries, you only have 4 options. You basically change its diaper, bring it some food, bring it a blanket. And if all else fails, call the doctor. You'll be all right. I said, okay, I felt a little bit better. But I did want to learn more about child development. And that's really when I started getting into psychoanalysis and reading Lacan and thinking about care and reading the other traditions out of Freud has been extremely helpful in terms of just learning how kids operate, but also how humans operate, and learning how to be the best dad I can be. And that's really all that any of this amounts to as far as my own personal interests go. Professionally, I want to be able to give back to the community and the profession that has done so much for me, namely the tradition of psychoanalysis. To this day, I still don't know whether and to what extent my own analyst was a Lacanian. It doesn't matter to me, but it's interesting. Whatever she did resonates very strongly for me with how I understand Lacan talking through the technical aspects of psychoanalytic experience. And that meant so much to me. It has done so much to change my life that I thought to myself, what am I doing here? Writing these books, publishing these articles, teaching these classes. What community do I want to give back to the most? And this is one that is meaningful to me because it changed so much of my life. So professionally, yes, Lectures on Lacan is all about helping folks make clear, coherent, and accessible texts that are very difficult, but that I also found profoundly illuminating and technically informing around clinical practice. Personally, though, not professionally, but personally, I'm doing all of this shit in order to be the best dad that I possibly can be. I'd say the best partner as well, and the best friend that I can be, and just the best human that I can be. I think there is an ethics of psychoanalysis that helps you be all of those things. But for me, it's about being the best parent that I can be. And ultimately, I think that's what reading Lacan amounts to, is learning how to be a good human, especially for those who need you most, for dependents. It teaches you how to be an authority, for instance, how to be a parent, how to be a caregiver in ways that I believe are fundamentally kind and generous and healthy and non-maladaptive. So I find it very useful in that regard. It has absolutely informed my parenting. And I have a happy little kid, and I love her, and she's loving life. And I think that it means a lot to see her thriving, because she's also been through some things, as we all have. But to see her thriving, I thank Lacan for some of that. I don't just read him as a scholar. I also read him as a kind of advisor sometimes about how to be with others, including those who need your being with more than anybody else.
Well, that was very powerful, and I'm glad I asked that, because that was really moving. I get the sense that it was a primary motivation to get into psychoanalysis in the first place. Which is a very interesting perspective, and I really like that idea that psycho and the ethics, and not just psychoanalysis in general, but the way you're using psychoanalysis is learning to be a good human for those who need you the most, for those who are dependent. And that makes a lot of sense in the context of what we've been talking about the way psychoanalysis grounds the cogito, grounds the mind, not in a I think therefore I am, but in a I'm helpless and I'm on the verge of death.
You know what, Adele, that's fabulous. I'm so happy you bring that up, because I emphasize for your parents, for your friends, for your lovers, for your children. But you know what? The greatest other in our own lives, as my friend John Durham Peters put it so many years ago, is ourselves. I am the alien that stalks my very existence. I'm also among those humans who deserve the type of kindness that psychoanalysis has taught me to share with others. And I think that's a really important part here, because all of this in Lacanian thought emerges from a central core relation to oneself. You've heard that image when you get on the plane, right? the masks are going to drop down. Put your mask on before you put it on the child sitting next to you. And somehow that feels incorrect as a parent. You think, no, the child always comes first. But part of what that messaging is in Lacan and on flights is that you can't help them until you're able to help yourself. And the type of kindness that you learn to show yourself in psychoanalysis is the very same that you can extend then to others. And the types of forgiveness and promissory notes that come with that as well, I think is really key. So let's just make sure we add to the list, as you so wonderfully did, ourselves as those fragile beings as well. We are also children who need others.
Absolutely. You know, I just have a chance to say in my Twitter bio there, my Twitter bio is I equals another. And I like that idea, you know, because it actually came up in your lecture as well, is this the idea of being with yourself is in relationship to the other seen, the unconscious.
Yes.
You know,
this is why Socrates said he was never lonely.
Right.
This is also why you see a spike of loneliness right now.
I think that I've during Corona, I followed some spiritual teachers. One of them was Osho. And I like that Osho said, he had a talk titled "From Loneliness to Aloneness." This distinction from loneliness to aloneness, and aloneness is, in some sense, I think, part of a recognition of the unconscious, a part of the capacity to be with oneself as an other to oneself. Whereas I think people who fall into loneliness, they actually are disconnected from the other, which is their own self. And in consequence, lonely people, I think, and I think this is something that Nietzsche speaks to a lot and really well, is that people who are lonely, and I think perhaps we could also extend that people who have just a model of self-consciousness, they use social life to escape loneliness, as opposed to when you can be alone with yourself, well, then you can be that much better in social life. You're not need it. You don't depend on it in that way, because you've taken care of, you know, that most fragile, dependent person in yourself. And I do like that perspective, that the more I can take care of myself, the more I can care for the other as the other human being, and the more I can give the world, the more. And if you try to do it the opposite way, if you try to, as I think Lacan and Hegel would say, if you're that beautiful soul that is denouncing the world and maybe the activist energy trying to change the whole world, that you've got to start maybe with yourself first, yourself as the other, and yourself as the alien.
I think that's about right. I like too that you hook this back into the unconscious, because that's the part of self that's always there with me. And as long as I can be there with it, hence my emphasis on the Heideggerian notion of Mitdasein, being there with, not just Dasein, but Mitdasein, being there with oneself. You get it very well summarized too in the English expression, being by oneself. It means being next to oneself. The type of experience is a fundamentally ecstatic one. It's a feeling of ecstasy to be with oneself. And that's why I link it to the drive too, because the drive operationalized is first and foremost autoerotic. It's an ability to be with oneself, to enjoy one's openings, one's limitations. And that autoeroticism that is the start of what I would refer to as real enjoyment at the level of the drive is really an important starting place for all intimate relationships. The primary bubble is between me and myself. But I think there's enough work out there on think of Sherry Turkle's work and folks after her, where you just really have a very clear statement on the way that mobile phones inscribed with high-speed internet have changed all this, because as soon as one of us feels by ourselves or alone, we immediately reach for a phone. And suddenly that opportunity to learn how to be by and with oneself is always mediated, as you say, like by this rush into society. And what happens then is when your phone runs out of batteries, or your Instagram connection is down, you experience this profound sense of loneliness, because you no longer have the training and the experience of being by yourself to know what to do in that moment. You're constantly passing into the public and into society. This is a very classic modern dilemma. It's a really Kierkegaard up through Heidegger. This has been a big deal. But now you've got the new communication technologies that make it a little more apparent and profound. I don't know that this generation, this day, this mobile phone encrusted population is more lonely than any others in the past. I see it as more of a fundamental problem. And for the reasons that you just pointed out, that unless and until you're able to be in dialogue with yourself, you better just go ahead and just hold off trying to figure out the rest of the world around you. And I think that's a pretty central Lacanian insight as well.
Yeah. There's a few things there that I like the way you were talking about the ecstasy of being with oneself.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way you were talking about drive and operationalism as a type of autoerotic. And I even think about this relationship between the primary narcissism and real love that oftentimes, I feel like people can fight against that autoeroticism in order to uphold a moral image of real love, when really it's the cultivation of that autoeroticism inside oneself which allows one to be capable of real love, that there's a connection there between the two, and there's a process perhaps of mediation in the symbolic to make that real. Like, and here I'm going from the imaginary to the symbolic to the real of love. And the imaginary being maybe caught up in the specular images of autoeroticism, let's say. But here, coming to the end of the conversation, I was wondering if we could come to the end of the ÉCRITS, because at the end, you already mentioned at the end of the ÉCRITS, there's that the paper on science and truth.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Which is a great paper, which is I don't know if you would put that in the same category of overlooked, because I think a lot of people do read that one.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it like you said, and you already pointed it to the fact that it opens us up into some crucial seminars.
Mm-hmm.
And we already talked a little bit about that distinction between knowledge and truth, which comes into psychoanalysis. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the difference that we see in that article between objective scientific knowledge and psychoanalytic truth as cause, because it seems to me like that would be connected to some of the final things we've been talking about as it regards to, let's say, death, love, the other, caring for the others who are dependent on us, maybe also drive and autoeroticism and things like this, which perhaps objective scientific knowledge doesn't help us deal with so much, but psychoanalysis could.
Yeah. Well, ever since my series on Seminar 10, where Lacan develops this notion of objectality, so early 1960s, I've never tired of coming back to this very topic. You can see it in almost all of the lectures on Lacan's materials, is this return to a distinction between scientific fetishization of objectivity and psychoanalytic imperatives on objectality. And I think this really gets at a core distinction between most of the traditions in which folks are trained today, philosophical and scientific, and psychoanalysis as a tradition. So Lacan's riff on this is a pretty compelling one, and it's rather simple. Science is concerned with stuff, with objects, with beings in the world. And psychoanalysis is less concerned with the objects in the world than the openings from which they emerge. What he's interested in at the level of psychoanalytic thought, Lacan, is cause. And I think this is partly one of the reasons why Kant and Lacan link up so well. Very terrific thinkers around causality. So a scientist might be interested, for instance, in this pen, in the materials of which it's comprised. An economist might be, Milton Friedman-esque, like want to talk about where the rubber comes from and all this kind of shit. What Lacan's going to come along and talk about is the condition of possibility for this pen to even emerge as an object of scientific inquiry in the first place. So what Lacan's going to say is, in order for this pen to pop on the screen and thus emerge as an object of scientific inquiry, it must be distinguishable from the wall behind it. And in order for that distinction to be maintained, there must be a minimum irreducible difference or distance between this pen and the wall behind it, at least in a perceptual field. Now, I'm moving fast here because I know we're at the end of our time. Lacan's point, though, is that in order for this object to occur, it has to exist in a differential relationship to the background relative to its foreground. And that differential relationship is itself a third element to be studied. In psychoanalysis, we use objet A. Little a designates the minimum irreducible difference between this foregrounded entity known as a pen and all the background shit that you start to ignore when phenomenologically you start focusing on the pen. And what Lacan wants to say is that that opening, that gap, that fissure, or that line of difference, that pure difference between the pen and the wall. Think about it. The separation between the pen and the wall is neither a pen nor the wall. It's something totally different. The minimum irreducible distance is a space in which the pen is not, nor the wall. And Lacan wants to say that if that irreducible distance were ever to close, the pen would disappear and all you would have is the wall. There would be no phenomenological distinction, and thus the scientific object would disappear. You wouldn't be able to study it. This study of foregrounds, backgrounds, and the differential relations between them is the science of psychoanalysis as a thought tradition. And the word Lacan uses for this is objectality with an A. It's a study of the causes or the conditions of possibility for objectivity that would be the fetishistic object choice of science, modern science in particular. This, for Lacan, is not a field of beings, but a field of non-being, because the minimum irreducible distance between the pen and the wall is a space in which nothing, pen nor wall, appears. And that objet A is the symbol we use to mark those places in conversation, in culture, in medium and small size dry goods. Name your philosophical conversation about an entity in the world. And Lacan's going to say, let's back up and talk about the causes or the conditions for the emergence of that thing as an object. And now you can see another great connecting rod between Heidegger and Lacan. The hermeneutic phenomenology that Heidegger is cracking in the 1920s is not too far removed from the type of thinking that Lacan is going to label as the science of psychoanalysis, this study of objectality. The final thing I would just say about this, bringing it to the question of the drive, is that science in the traditional sense studies objects, but psychoanalysis as a form of critical inquiry, it doesn't study objects, it studies openings. And that's a really important distinction. Not the positivity of the world, but the ways that absences in the world can nevertheless be signified and discussed. That's what Lacan is interested in. And that's why I say there is no ontology of psychoanalysis. There is only a meontology, from the Greek me meaning non and ontos meaning being. Psychoanalysis as a form of critical scientific inquiry, hysterical scientific inquiry, is focused on non-being. And that's precisely what you see between the pen and the wall, is a field of non-being. That's why objet A is such a central concept for psychoanalysis in Lacan's sense, because it allows us to name that third element, the differential relation between the pen and the wall that allows the former to become an object of scientific inquiry. So that move that you see Lacan working up to in Science and Truth, he wants psychoanalysis to remain a science, but it is a science of openings. It's a study of causes and conditions of possibility, a field not of beings in the world, but non-being that makes that world possible. And that's why he thinks that psychoanalysis is kind of like a trump card to philosophy and modern science. Because in philosophy and modern science, you see a fetishization of what is, the outer limit of which is the study known as ontology. Psychoanalysis, though, shows us that propping up any given entity, any given quid, any given phenomenon, is this field of non-being, a field of pure multiplicity, of radical difference. And that's really where you can put Lacan, if you want to put him in a philosophical tradition, is that he belongs in a tradition of thinkers from Heraclitus forward that focus on the multiplicity of the world, not from Parmenides forward, that would focus on the being and the entities that cohere. For Lacan, coherence, oneness, completion, singularity, these are all effects of a more primordial cause, which is difference, differentiality, gappiness, if you will. So that's a long, quick story because, again, I know we're at the end of our time. It's something that I come back to routinely in the series. So anytime you queue up lectures on Lacan, you'll hear riffs along these lines. But I think the most important thing to remember is objectivity in modern science is not the same as objectality in Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's a great question. Thank you.
No, well, and I think this has been a really fun conversation. So I'm glad we've had it, and there's so many interesting things where I feel like this conversation could keep on going, and I hope the conversation does keep on going between us because I think it's very, very fruitful, and I hope that this video is going to be very helpful for those who are either already enrolled in the ÉCRITS course, which is going to be starting on September 3rd.
Yay!
Or for those who might be intrigued by this very conversation and being like, okay, I can't put this book on the shelf any longer. I've got to pull it out and start reading it, and maybe need a community to read along with. But with that being said, I would like you perhaps also to, and I'll leave links in the description to lectures on Lacan, your work, also your book, The Chattering Mind. If there's anything, I know there is something coming up this fall, if there's anything that you would like to let viewers know about if they want to get involved in your work, what would that be, sir?
Man, that's a great question. Nah, there's nothing to know. There's nothing to know. I think I want to just emphasize the importance of the point you made about reading ÉCRITS in a community, in a group. And I think that's why the work that you're doing is so important, because you're bringing people together. And I think Lacan is one of those thinkers that you probably shouldn't read after dark, and you probably shouldn't read by yourself. Reading Lacan in a group with others can be very, very productive if you've got a good shepherd. And I think that it's really great, that kind of community building that can come from this, because Lacanians in my history have always been very alienating in their interactions with others. I can remember before I started reading Lacan, I was bigger into Hegel and Kant and German idealism and the like. And I can remember thinking, like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? And why are you talking about it in a way that makes it so inaccessible? Like, I was studying Hegel and thinking, like, well, this is a great way to think. And it was pretty easy to articulate and talk with people about, and we were building community that way. But it felt like the community of Lacanians was very exclusive and alienating. And everybody was always dropping these like fucking buzzwords and then unable to explain them. And I think one of the reasons why we have that dilemma is that so many people read secondary scholars on Lacan, and they lapse into all these little buzzwords and bumper stickers and jokes and quips, beyond which they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And the reason why they don't know what the fuck they're talking about is because they spend so much time with the secondary sources and so little time doing the actual work of reading the primary source. So I just want to pause on this final note and just applaud you for doing the work of bringing folks back to the primary sources, and in a way that builds community instead of shutting people out. And I think that those two elements alone are a curative recipe for the tradition of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Read Lacan himself and do it with a group and fucking have fun with it. Make some friends and lovers while you're working through this material, because otherwise the temptation is to become one more $20 word slinger who knows nothing about Lacanian psychoanalysis, but everything about the secondary scholarship out there. And the truth is that we secondary scholars just aren't as good as the original. Read the fucking original. Remember what I said. You don't have to be a genius to do this. You have to be an idiot to do this. You have to have follow through and willpower. Desire doesn't get you far. Willpower is what makes you a Lacanian. And I think that if we can remain humble like that and be idiots before a text that we find baffling and then continually return to it, we'll be doing the work of following in Lacan's footsteps, in returning to and remaining loyal to the meaning of his texts. But you can't get there if all you stay with is the secondaries. So I love this conversation. I'm glad we've had it, but I also would have preferred that people spent the last hour or so reading Lacan instead of listening to us. So
Well,
that said, man,
well,
I got nothing, you know where to find me.
All right. Well, a little. I loved a lot of that. A little humble, because there will be links in the description to Samuel's work if you're interested in following those rabbit holes wherever they may lead. I encourage that. And time flies because we've been at this for 2 hours and 15 minutes. So hopefully it's been a fun conversation.
2.5 hours, you could have been halfway through.
You could have got through the subject and the subject and the field, the whole subversion of the subject and the dialectic of desire. But you know what? That's the principle of Philosophy Portal, what you were articulating there. The principle of Philosophy Portal is that we go back to the primary sources. We do full lectures on the primary source materials, and primary sources are superior to secondary sources. It takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more conceptual mediation, but it's also great to do it with a group of other crazy people who are also into that type of thing. So, like Samuel said, hopefully there'll be a few friends and maybe a few lovers along the way. For anyone who joins the course, nothing wrong with that. And I just want to again extend my thanks to Samuel for having this conversation. This has been a conversation about the ÉCRITS, focusing on some of the more obscure aspects of the ÉCRITS, but in the Philosophy Portal course, we'll be going through the whole thing. So if you're interested in that, there'll also be a link in the description. And with that, I'll thank everyone for their time and have a great night.
Right on. Thanks, man.